Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have my September wrap up. So as you can probably imagine, this video is going to contain my reviews for all of the books that I have read in September. But before we get started, I would like to introduce you to today's video sponsor, Byzans. Now, Byzans is an app that is available on both Android and iPhone. And what Byzans essentially does is combines elements present on Goodreads and also elements of instant messaging apps like WhatsApp or Discord. So the way that Byzans works is that you will search for the book that you are currently reading and then you can join the club associated with that book, which means that you will be able to talk to people who are also reading that book in real time. There are two separate areas of Byzans, so you have just a general area where you can just discuss general points about the book, and then you also have a separate area where you can break the book down into chapters and discuss spoilers. Now, what I personally love about Byzans is that it has the best features of the Goodreads group section, where you can kind of organize your book clubs and break the books down into chapters and you can have a discussion, but it is a much easier to use app. I personally think that Byzans is going to be pretty indispensable when it comes to things like online book clubs or buddy reads with a large group of people, because instead of having to organize a Twitter chat or Goodreads, which is a good website, I enjoy Goodreads, but the functionality is not great. You will just be able to have one app on your phone which is actually specifically built for things like online book clubs, read-alongs and buddy reads. Now, Byzans is completely free of charge and there are absolutely no ads at all, so if you would like to join Byzans, all of the links for the Byzans app will be in my description box if you are interested in checking it out. So moving into my wrap up, September was an okay reading month for me. It definitely wasn't my best. I read just over 3,000 pages and normally I think I average it around 3,500. I did read some pretty chunky books and I also read my most anticipated release of the year, which definitely held up my progress because I was a little bit anxious about reading that. You probably know what that is, but if not, you will find out later on in this video what that book was. But if we are looking at September as an overview, I would kind of just say it was utterly average. I didn't read the most books. I didn't read a lot of really good books. So it was just your everyday average reading month. So as usual, we will start with my reading stats for September. So in September, I read a total of 9 books, which came to 3,015 pages and an average of 100.5 pages per day. For the star ratings, I gave 1 2-star rating, 1 3-star, 1 3.5, 4 4-stars and 2 5-star ratings, and this broke down to an average of a 3.83 rating for September. For the demographics, I read 3 adult books and 6 young adult. For the formats, we had 6 physical books, 1 audiobook, 1 manga and 1 anthology. For the genres, we had 4 fantasy, 3 contemporary, 1 horror and 1 collection of short stories that spanned multiple genres. And then finally, for the places where I sourced these books, 4 of the books I have hauled in 2019. 3 of them came from my own TBR from before 2019. 1 was a library book and 1 book I read on Scribd. So getting straight into the reviews, as usual, I will be proceeding chronologically. And the first book that I completed in September was The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kiersten White. Now, this was also my least favourite read of the month. This is the book that I've categorized as horror. It wasn't particularly horrific, but this is kind of a tribute to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a classic horror story. So I thought I would kind of categorize this as horror, but it fell flat on so many levels. So the storyline of this, as you can probably imagine, centers around Elizabeth Frankenstein as opposed to Victor Frankenstein. Now, Elizabeth, I believe, is very, very briefly mentioned in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. However, the last and only time I have read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I was 15 and I now no longer remember very much about it. So Elizabeth Frankenstein is a young girl when the Frankenstein family comes upon her. She is being looked after by this abusive woman as her mother has died and her father has been imprisoned. Now, the Frankensteins have been looking for Elizabeth because they are looking for a companion for Victor, who is very willful and very aggressive and prone to very strange and disturbing behavior. So they believe that seeking a companion for Victor will kind of smooth out his edges and make him more presentable and maybe distract him from all of these dangerous and disturbing things that he has found himself into. Now, when I went into this book, I thought it was going to be Elizabeth's life story and how she has grown up with the Frankensteins and how this has followed her into teenage years. But the way that this was told, I just wasn't a fan of. So the story starts out where Elizabeth is going looking for Victor because Victor went to university 2 years ago, and in the span of this time he has written her a total of 4 letters. Elizabeth is very insecure with her position in the Frankenstein household because she is just a ward. She was never officially adopted, she isn't betrothed to Victor, and the Frankensteins are falling upon hard times. So Elizabeth believes that if she does not prove her usefulness and she does not prove that Victor still needs her, then there is a very big chance that she will be cast out. So we are following Elizabeth and the Frankenstein's governess Justine as they are searching for Victor Frankenstein, and a reasonable amount of the first part of this novel is literally just Elizabeth going to various people who live in the area where Victor's university is, asking them if they've seen Victor, to which they reply no, and then she just goes off and finds somebody else over and over and over again. Now, in between Elizabeth incessantly searching for Victor, we have flashbacks that show things like how Elizabeth met Victor the day that she was taken into the Frankenstein home, and days that Victor did something particularly notable, and how Elizabeth reacted, etc. Now, I understand that this is done so that we can get to know the backstory of the characters and their relationship with each other for what comes at the end. However, I don't like that it was told that way. I would have much rather it was just a chronological account of Elizabeth Frankenstein's life. When I was reading this, I did ask on Twitter whether this book gets any less boring, and I think Bobby from Bobby Reads Too Much did tell me that it does, but only after the halfway mark, and pretty much bang on halfway this did get a little bit exciting. However, what I found is that we had this really slow burn, utterly boring in my opinion. I know people do like this book, but I just did not enjoy it. Utterly boring lead up to a whole series of events that happen so rapidly that they are extremely rushed. But when I did get to the halfway mark and things started picking up, I was starting to enjoy this book, but I wasn't fully into it because I didn't really care about anything that was happening, and my thoughts when reading this essentially was, why was this book written? I understand that it was a tribute to Mary Shelley for an anniversary event that happened a couple of years ago, but this added nothing to the original tale of Frankenstein. Now, obviously we find in a lot of literature, especially things like classics and mythology, the women of the story are often overlooked, and I believe that Kiersten White does tend to focus on female characters in situations like this, or female versions of historical characters and things like that, and kind of gives them their own voice in a place where they previously did not have one. However, don't think that this added anything to the story, and it also, I thought it was going to be more of a character driven story of just Elizabeth and Victor and their relationship with each other, but this essentially retold Frankenstein, and it wasn't necessary, because aside from being from Elizabeth's perspective, which didn't need to be told, it didn't add anything new to the story. So I gave this 2 stars, and I would not recommend. So the next 5 books I'm going to be talking about I read for the Sobathon, which was a readathon that I co-hosted in the month of September, and the aim of this readathon was to read books that would make you cry or would make you emotional for whatever reason. So the first book I completed for Sobathon was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This was a collection of adult short stories that spanned a range of genres, including horror, science fiction, dystopian, fantasy and magical realism. So they were all fantastical stories, but they weren't all one genre. This was the library book that I read for the month, and the reason that I read it for Sobathon is that I believed that some of these stories would be quite hard hitting, as this collection centers on women and their body and the way that other people treat and view women's bodies. Now, I did give this a 3.5 rating overall. I don't typically give half-star ratings, but when I read a short story collection, I do give each individual story a rating and then break it down into an average, and the average for this collection did come out at 3.5. Now, I did enjoy this collection. I did rate quite a few stories highly, but I will be 100% completely honest and say that magical realism and speculative fiction is not my thing, and I will also completely admit to the fact that my brain just does not work in a way that processes these stories in a way that I can understand them. I very much do not like ambiguity in books, and I like my stories to give me answers. I don't want to have 10 possible reasons for why things happened at the end of a story. This is a problem that I encounter quite frequently in short stories, which is why I don't typically love them, and it was something that I encountered in this collection. However, what I can very much say and very much praise this book on is that these stories are so atmospheric and beautifully written. Even though I didn't understand what was going on 100% of the time in this collection, I did very much enjoy the writing and I felt very immersed in these stories. There are a couple of triggers in this collection. There is one story in particular that does center on a woman whose sisters have had this mysterious procedure, and when they have had it, they say that they feel great, they've never felt better, and everything's fine. So our main character does go to have that procedure, and it is some sort of weight loss procedure, but the way that weight loss and body image is discussed in that story, I feel maybe particularly triggering to people who suffer from an eating disorder, so be wary of that going in. It also deals with themes of things like men's possessiveness over their wives' bodies, and one of my particular favorite stories in this collection was called, I think, was it called Inventory, and it told a story of an apocalypse by some kind of virus, but the way that the story was told, it was in a woman's inventory of the sexual partners that she'd had. This book definitely deals with sex and sexuality very openly, and it also has a lot of LGBT rep, which is on Voices, because I believe that Carmen Maria Machado herself is in a female-female relationship, and I think all but one of these stories do involve female-female relationships. Next up, I finished Orange, the Complete Collection Volume 2 by Ichigo Takano. This is a contemporary manga series. I gave this volume 4 stars. Volume 1 was my favorite book of the year so far. It isn't anymore, and you will find out why very soon. But this one, I gave 4 stars. So if you are unfamiliar with Orange, it is a very emotional contemporary manga series. It does have a bit of a science fiction twist, but it follows a 16-year-old girl who receives a letter from her future self saying that if she does not act now and change a couple of things that her older self will direct her to change, then a boy who is just about to transfer into her class will soon die. Now, while it does have that sci-fi twist, this definitely does focus on the contemporary side of things, and this is definitely a book that is more about the relationship between this friendship group and their dynamics, and it has this awesome love triangle, and their friendship is just great. And the thing that I really loved about the first volume of this, and what I still loved about in the second, it's just the way that this book made me feel. It was so cute, it was so sweet, and I felt all of the feelings, and my heart was just completely in it. Now, before I get into why I gave this 4 stars, I will say that the way that mental health is treated in this story is not the best. It very much puts the responsibility of somebody who is suffering with mental health on the shoulders of those around them, as opposed to on the person themselves. However, I believe that in Japan, attitudes towards mental health are very different to how we view things in the West. And so, considering that this is from a Japanese author, I would say that this book would actually be pretty progressive, because it deals with mental health head on, and while we with a Western lens may not think that this deals with things in the best way, it is written from somebody who comes from a very different background and a very different culture. Now, there are a couple of reasons why I gave this 4 stars. One is that I was just not as emotionally invested as I expected to be. I do like the first volume a lot more, and it gave me a lot more feelings. I will admit that I do rate this series pretty emotionally, because I loved how it made me feel. But the main reason that I gave this 4 stars is that only 2/3 of the second volume of this is actually the Orange story, and then the last third of the book is a short story called Haruro Astronaut, which Ichigo Takano said started off as an art exercise and turned into a story where she wanted to use all of her favorite shoujo romance tropes. So the short story I didn't love. I would probably give that 3 stars. Essentially, it follows a set of twins. People keep confusing them. They both kind of fall for the same hot guy, and one of them is willing to let the other one have him, but the other one doesn't want him because the other one does. But then there ends up being 3 hot guys, and it is essentially about the more shy twin coming into herself and learning to kind of live her life instead of stepping back and letting her sister have everything. And while it was enjoyable, it was reasonably cute, I just didn't really have much of an opinion on it, and it was a little bit bizarre. I then finished the group book for Subathon, which was Girls on the Verge by Sharon Biggs Waller, and I listened to this as an audiobook on Scribd. I gave this one 4 stars. I enjoyed it a lot. It is a very poignant contemporary story for the way that things are in the US at the moment. So this is a young adult contemporary that follows a girl who has just found out that she is pregnant, and she doesn't want to keep the baby. She is into theatre, and she has got this amazing amazing place at an exclusive theatre camp over summer, which she is unfortunately going to have to miss. And she will also be going to college in the fall, so she would like an abortion, as she would very much like to pursue her own life and her career and her goals, etc. So our main character confides in her best friend, who is a very devout Christian, and her best friend essentially just does not agree with anything that is going on and refuses to talk to the main character, who then has to reach out to a girl that she greatly admires to help her gain an abortion, as all of these characters live in the state of Texas, where it is very difficult to obtain abortions. Now, I give this 4 stars. I enjoyed it a lot, and I definitely think that it has a lot to say, and I think that it deals with a very difficult and sensitive topic that has a lot of contention surrounding it in a very easy to digest and emotionally impactful way. While I did not cry listening to this, I did feel a whole other range of emotions. I felt a lot of anger, I felt a lot of disgust coming from somebody who lives in the UK, where there aren't any restrictions on abortions in terms of determining who can have them. Anybody of any age can have an abortion in the UK, and they do not need parental consent or anything like that. So I was just kind of shocked and horrified at the lengths that this girl had to go to obtain the rights to decide what she does with her own body. The reason that I didn't give it a full 5 stars is that while I felt that it dealt with a very important topic, and I definitely am glad that I read this to give me a little bit more insight into what is actually going on in the US, because obviously I see things, but I don't think I will ever be able to firsthand experience or understand somebody's perspective on that. So I would absolutely 100% give it 5 stars for the importance of the topic and the way that the topic was dealt. But as it being a novel, which it is, even though it is kind of meant to be informative on the topic it deals with, it is also a novel that is meant as a form of entertainment. And as a novel, there were a couple of things that I didn't love about it. There's nothing that I actively disliked about it, but it just didn't blow my mind storyline wise. There were heartwarming moments, and it definitely says a lot about friendship, and I enjoyed watching the girls bond as they go on this road trip so the main character can have an abortion, but it just didn't wow me. Aside from that, there was an issue with the characters, I feel, because as I mentioned, we have the heavily Christian best friend, and then we have the other friend who is the complete opposite, and she is a women's rights activist. She knows a lot about abortion laws, and I just felt that having these two characters that were complete extremes were kind of just a slight bit caricaturish. I did enjoy both of the characters, and I definitely enjoyed having both of their perspectives, but the way that they were written and developed, they did pretty much solely exist to illustrate the points that the author was trying to get across. So we had one character who was very pro-life and one that was very pro-choice, and it very much felt to me like these characters were not people. They were just embodiments of each side of the argument. The next book that I completed was A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. I gave this one 4 stars, and this is a young adult fantasy that follows our main character Connor, whose mother has cancer and is not very well, and Connor has kind of been left to look after himself in ways when his mother isn't feeling too good, or when she has just completed a round of chemotherapy. He will have to do things that normally an adult would do for him, like make his own meals and clean, because his mother doesn't have the energy. And one night Connor is woken up from a nightmare, and he goes to the window and he sees a monster, and the monster tells Connor that he is going to visit him several times and tell him 3 stories. But when the monster is done telling his stories, Connor then has to tell the monster a story, and the story has to be the truth. So while this has a fantastical element in the monster, this is very much a story that deals with grief, and it is about Connor, who is 12 years old, coming to terms with what is actually happening to his mother. It also deals with the emotions and feelings that are very much present in situations like this. I can kind of speak from experience, where you feel a lot of denial and you feel a lot of guilt, and sometimes you will think things about the person who is sick that you don't really mean, but you think you're a terrible person for thinking these things. And it is essentially just the story of a 12-year-old boy who has a very sick mother who may be dying or may not be dying, he's not sure, and it is about how he's processing these emotions and just how you come to terms with all of that stuff. So I did obviously find this very emotional. I did cry right at the end. I was worried about going into this based on my own personal experience. I did find that while it was similar in some aspects, it was very different in others, and the aspects that I actually found relatable were not the bits that impacted me. I didn't think I was going to cry. It was the very, very last page when I did eventually shed a tear or two. Now that I'm coming to review it, I can't remember why I gave this 4 stars and not 5. I'm guessing that it just didn't fully wow me. I wasn't blown away by this story, but I do think that it was very well written. I feel like it deals with a very sensitive topic. Grief and death is something that happens that we just don't talk about. We spend all of our lives avoiding talking about our deaths, and when we are dying or when we are very ill, we struggle to talk to the people that are close to us and the people that we care about. And I really liked how this book tackled that topic, because realistically death is probably something that we should talk about a little bit more, and books like this will help people to learn about death and critical illness and things like that in a very digestible and emotional manner. This book did make me angry in a couple of points, because touching on what I've just said, I didn't like the way that the adults treated Connor. Connor is going through a very difficult time. His main caregiver is not able to care for him, and his mother is a single parent, and I feel like the unwillingness of the adults in this story to deal with Connor was infuriating, and I did not like how that was handled. So I did get a little bit angry and a little bit frustrated about that, but aside from that, I really enjoyed this book and I would recommend it. My final read of Sobathon was Life on the Refrigerator Door by Alice Quipers. Still can't say that author's name. This one I gave 3 stars, and the storyline of this is essentially the same as A Monster Calls, but without the monster. So this is a young adult contemporary story that is interestingly formatted in that it is told entirely in notes on the refrigerator door. So in this we have 2 characters. We have a teenage girl and we also have her mother, and they lead very busy lifestyles. The daughter is obviously a student. She has a lot of schoolwork to do, as well as a social life and after school activities and things like that. And her mother is a midwife, so she works a lot of long hours and long shifts. She's a single parent, so she takes a lot of overtime, and because she's a midwife, she can be called out at any hour of any day. Because of this, our 2 characters predominantly communicate through notes on the refrigerator door, as they are always coming and going and missing each other or not being able to spend very much time with each other. Not too far into this book, it was a very short book, I read this in like an hour, but not far into it we find out that our main character's mother is having some health issues. Like I said, this book deals with pretty much the exact same thing that A Monster Calls does, but I didn't really feel anything while reading this, and once again this is a topic that is pretty close to me and I can kind of speak on from first-hand experience, and I felt absolutely nothing. Now the reason that I believe that I didn't really feel much is because in between the notes on the refrigerator door, the characters will talk to each other and things will happen, but we only get to read the notes on the refrigerator door. So anything that happens in between those notes is not really conveyed well to the reader. We will just get the aftermath on it, where one of the characters will be like, oh, thanks for sitting down and discussing this with me last night, we're all gonna be okay, it's gonna be fine, etc. But the actual emotional parts of this story, which is what is going on in between these notes, is not depicted, and so I just didn't really feel anything at all when I was reading this. If you don't think that you are emotionally ready for A Monster Calls and you want to read another book on that topic, then I would kind of recommend this, because I think that this would be more suitable for younger teens who do want to kind of read about this topic but they don't want to cry their eyes out, because yeah, it's a lighter version of A Monster Calls. The next book that I read after Sobathon was The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owen. I did do a full reading vlog on this where I go in detail into the plot of this and all of my thoughts as I am going through the book. But as for my rating, I did give this 4 stars and I really enjoyed it, and I am surprised because I did not see good things about this book on Twitter. So this is a young adult fantasy story with a very complex plot. As I have done a full video on this without any spoilers, I will try and be very brief about it here. But this is set in a world where the society hierarchy is segregated by bird castes. Our main character is a crow, which is the lowest of the bird caste, and the highest caste is the phoenix caste, and they are the royalty of the world. And then you have like the hawks that are like the soldiers, and the vultures that are the security, and the swans are the courtesans and things like that. So as I just mentioned, every caste kind of has a purpose, and the purpose of our main character's caste is that they go and retrieve the bodies of people who have died from the sinner's plague. Now every caste does have a magical ability aside from the crows, but the crows do have the ability to pull magic from bones. So it's quite common for a crow to demand payment for their services in the teeth of the dead, and from those teeth they will be able to use the power of the caste. So for example, the phoenix caste has the power of fire, and if a crow has a phoenix tooth, they will be able to manifest fire magic. Now the plot of this is that our main character and her band of crows go to the palace to retrieve the bodies of the crown prince and his bodyguard, as they have both died of the plague. However, when they are not far out of the palace grounds, it turns out that the prince and his bodyguard aren't actually dead, but they do fear for their lives at the hand of the queen. So they pretended to die of the plague to hatch a plan to escape and get to their nearest allies, where they will hopefully raise an army and then take the kingdom back from the queen. Now as I said, this was a lot more complex than I expected. I knew going into it that we would have a caste system, but I didn't know how complex the magic system and the political structure of the world would be in here. I did think that the plot of this and the world building was very well thought out, and I definitely think that my favorite thing about this was the world, the political system, and the magic system. I also really liked the characters. The main character Fi is very feisty. She is very aggressive. This book deals with things like prejudice and oppression. As I mentioned previously, the crows are the lowest of the low, and people think that they're scum, and our main character is very distrustful and also very angry about this, because her entire life she has been treated like filth. This is juxtaposed with the prince, who is a prince and has lived his life in a palace, and everything he has ever wanted has always been handed to him. And the way that those two interacted, I think, was a perfect example and illustration of privilege, and how some people don't realize the privilege that they have, and even though you think you understand how other people who are less privileged than you live, you don't really understand. Just touching upon the romance briefly in this, I really liked the romance. The only complaint that I have is that it was slow burn for quite some time, and then it kind of went from 0 to 100 when it did kind of get going, like it really got going. But I did definitely enjoy those aspects, and there is also a lot of representation in here. As I said, it does have themes of prejudice, oppression, and privilege, but there is also POC representation in here, as the majority of the main characters are dark skinned. And we also have LGBTQ rep in here. We have one gay main character, one pansexual main character, and also a minor side character who I hope makes more of an appearance in the sequel, who is either trans or non-binary. But overall, I was like so shocked by how much I thoroughly enjoyed this book. The only reason that I did give it 4 stars instead of 5 is that some of the action scenes I didn't think were written the best way. You know, the kind where you're not really sure what's going on, or you don't understand how people have come to this conclusion. And there were definitely moments in here where I felt like I could solve the problem that the characters were in, even though they couldn't. So I could use the resources they had available to them to get them out of their predicament when they seemed thoroughly stuck. But otherwise, very surprised by this fantasy debut, and I would definitely recommend it. And then the last 2 books I read in September, the ones you've all been waiting for, were of course God's Grave and Dark Dawn by J. Kristoff. I did read God's Grave a lot earlier in the month. I think it was the 2nd book I finished, and Dark Dawn was the last book I finished, but I thought I would just talk about them both together. So I did give both of these 5 stars. These are the 2nd and the 3rd books in the Nevernight Chronicle, which I'm sure you guys know by now, even if you've only been watching my channel, is a adult fantasy series that follows a 16-year-old girl whose father is hanged for treason and whose mother is imprisoned. She is very kindly taken in by an old man, who then starts to train her for entry into the Red Church, which is a notorious school of assassins, so that she can go there, learn to be an assassin, and gain these skills that she requires to avenge her parents. So I'm just going to start by talking very briefly about God's Grave, and I will only be talking about this briefly because it is a reread, and then everything I kind of have to say about Dark Dawn will pretty much apply to the series as a whole. So God's Grave I did really enjoy. In this one we move from the assassin school setting to a more ancient Roman Rome gladiator setting, which I did really enjoy, and the characters that are introduced in that gladiator setting are some of my favorite in the series overall. So I gave this 5 stars and I really loved it, although the first book is still my favorite book in the series overall. And then Dark Dawn. This is my most anticipated book of the year, and it didn't disappoint. So with this being the last book in a series, I can't really discuss it in detail. I do have a book diary recorded for this, which I will be putting up hopefully sometime in the next couple of weeks. As I said with God's Grave about characters that were introduced, there was a new character introduced in this called Claude Corleone, who I just, God, if you've read it, you know. As for the conclusion, this was the make or break. I reluctantly say that Nevernight is one of my favorite series of all time, because up until reading this book I could not say for sure whether Nevernight was indeed one of my favorite series of all time, but I can now confirm that it was. Now I think this is my second favorite in the series. They are all phenomenal. I absolutely love them. I love J. Kristoff's writing style and the sarcasm and the comedy and how meta this gets in points, but if I were to rank them, this would be bang in the middle. This would be my second favorite. I loved the journey that our characters went on. We had highs, we had lows. Some of my favorite points in this book are scenes that we get in every last book in a fantasy series, where you have the characters that are left just hanging out and telling dirty jokes and things like that, and I just loved seeing the characters be happy together, even if it was just for a little while, because we all knew going into this that some pretty bad stuff was gonna happen. There were a couple of very emotional points in here. I did cry right at the very end, and I cried at one of the emotional points. The first emotional point I think was the most impactful thing that happened in this book for me personally, and even though I didn't cry, the reason I didn't cry is because I was in shock. I was filming for my book diary and everything, and I decided to read this I didn't know it was going to be emotional, but I decided to read one more chapter before I was going to bed, and I read it, and then 5 to 10 minutes later I filmed my book diary update, and I was just kind of in shock. And then I got into bed and about 5 or 10 more minutes passed, and then it kind of hit me what had happened, and that actually kept me awake. I was sleeping very lightly and I was convinced that the thing that happened in the book was real, and I did not sleep for a very long time because of that chapter. But that was a huge tangent. Essentially this was very emotional. There was a lot of action. I feel like everything was resolved well and everything came together. There were plot points in here that were wrapped up that I didn't even realize needed to be wrapped up, because I feel like the wrap up of the actual plot points was so well done that Jay had these things ongoing that I hadn't even realized I needed an answer to until I was handed an answer. And as with the other books in this series, even though it was the last book, there were still plenty of shocking reveals and plot twists and things like that. And something that Jay does really well is he leads you to believe something and then completely turns it on its head in such a crazy way that you did not even see it come in. Now the one point, if I'm going to review this critically for you guys, the one point that I have to say I'm not a huge fan of, I am emotionally, is the ending. Coming from a critical perspective, I don't love the ending. Coming from I have been invested in this series for approximately 3 years, and this is possibly my favorite series of all time from my favorite author of all time. I liked the ending, but either way, there were 2 ways that this book could have ended, this series could have wrapped up. Either way I would have been happy, but from a critical perspective, if I was reviewing this or rating this more critically, then I probably would not be giving it 5 stars because of that ending. So that is it for my very long September wrap up. I hope for my sake and yours that I can cut this down a lot in editing, because I have been talking for a very long time. But thank you for sticking with me this long if you have. Please also don't forget to go check out the Byzans app. All of the links are of course in my description box where you can sign up. And as I said, it is absolutely 100% free of charge and there are no ads either. So that's about it for my September wrap up. Please let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought of them. Please let me know how you felt about Dark Dawn if you have read Dark Dawn this month, because I know a lot of people have. And please also don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under all her petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.